Chapter 1. Monica and Dylan's eyes met across the crowded university cafeteria, and it was as if the world around them had faded away. There was an instant, undeniable connection between the two strangers, a spark that ignited an electric current of anticipation and possibility. Dylan, a tall, broad-shouldered engineering student, had been absent-mindedly waiting in line for his lunch when he caught sight of the petite, dark-haired beauty sitting alone at a table in the corner. There was something about the way she carried herself, the slight furrow of her brow as she pored over her textbooks, that drew his attention and wouldn't let go. Overcome by a sudden boldness, Dylan found himself weaving through the crowded tables, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached the young woman, she looked up, her deep brown eyes meeting his with a mixture of surprise and intrigue. "Hi, I'm Dylan," he said, mustering a confident smile. "I couldn't help but notice you sitting here all by yourself. Would you mind if I joined you?" Monica felt a flutter of nerves in the pit of her stomach as this handsome stranger addressed her. She had always been shy, preferring to keep to herself, but there was something about Dylan's warm, friendly demeanor that put her at ease. "I'm Monica," she replied, returning his smile. "And no, I don't mind at all. Please, have a seat." Dylan slid into the chair across from her, setting down his tray of food. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, both captivated by the other's presence. Then, as if guided by an invisible force, they began to talk, their conversation flowing effortlessly. Over the course of the next hour, Monica and Dylan discovered a deep, unexpected connection. They shared stories of their upbringings, their dreams and aspirations, their fears and insecurities. It was as if they had known each other their entire lives, rather than just meeting for the first time. When their lunch period came to an end, neither of them wanted to part ways. They exchanged phone numbers, both giddy with the prospect of seeing each other again. As Dylan watched Monica disappear into the throng of students, he knew that this chance encounter had the potential to change the course of his life forever. In the weeks that followed, Monica and Dylan's relationship blossomed. They spent every spare moment together, whether it was studying side by side in the library, taking long walks around the campus, or simply enjoying each other's company over coffee. The connection they shared was undeniable, and it wasn't long before they both realized that they had fallen deeply in love. Despite their limited financial means as university students, Monica and Dylan made the decision to get married shortly after graduating. They were young, but their love felt unbreakable, and they were eager to begin the next chapter of their lives together. With no place of their own, the newlyweds moved in with Monica's mother, Rebecca, a recently divorced woman in her mid-40s. Rebecca welcomed them with open arms, doting on Dylan as if he were her own son. She delighted in their youthful energy and enthusiasm, and the three of them soon fell into a comfortable, familial routine. As the months passed, Rebecca and Dylan's bond only grew stronger. They would often stay up late into the night, engaging in deep discussions about life, love, and the future. Rebecca marveled at Dylan's maturity and wisdom, and Dylan, in turn, found himself drawn to her warmth, intelligence, and zest for life. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the nature of their relationship began to shift. The once innocent exchanges and casual touches became charged with an undercurrent of tension and unspoken desire. Dylan found himself captivated by Rebecca's youthful appearance and confident demeanor, while Rebecca reveled in the attention and affection of this handsome young man who had become like a son to her. Neither Dylan nor Rebecca fully recognized the dangerous path they were treading, nor the devastating consequences that would soon follow. All they knew was that the more time they spent together, the more their hearts yearned for a forbidden connection that would shatter the very foundation of their family. As Monica remained blissfully unaware of the shifting dynamics between her husband and her mother, the seeds of betrayal had been sown, setting the stage for a tragic and all-consuming affair. Chapter 2. As the weeks passed, Dylan and Rebecca's bond only grew stronger. They would often stay up late into the night, engaging in deep discussions about life, love, and the future. Rebecca marveled at Dylan's maturity and wisdom, and Dylan, in turn, found himself drawn to her warmth, intelligence, and zest for life. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the nature of their relationship began to shift. The once innocent exchanges and casual touches became charged with an undercurrent of tension and unspoken desire. Dylan found himself captivated by Rebecca's youthful appearance and confident demeanor, while Rebecca reveled in the attention and affection of this handsome young man who had become like a son to her. Neither Dylan nor Rebecca fully recognized the dangerous path they were treading, nor the devastating consequences that would soon follow. All they knew was that the more time they spent together, the more their hearts yearned for a forbidden connection that would shatter the very foundation of their family. One evening, as Monica was out late studying with a group of classmates, Dylan and Rebecca found themselves alone in the cozy living room, sipping wine and engaging in a particularly deep conversation. The air was thick with an electricity that neither of them could ignore. "You know, Dylan," Rebecca said, her voice soft and warm, "I feel like I can talk to you about anything." "You're so insightful and mature for your age." Dylan felt his heart skip a beat at her words. "Thank you, Rebecca. I feel the same way about you. You've become such an important part of my life." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down around them. Rebecca reached out and gently placed her hand on Dylan's arm, her touch sending a jolt of electricity through his body. "Dylan, Rebecca hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. "I don't know how to say this, but I've developed feelings for you. Feelings that go beyond just a mother-in-law and son-in-law." Dylan's eyes widened, his mind racing with a whirlwind of emotions. He had been trying to push down his own growing attraction to Rebecca, but now, hearing her confession, he felt a mix of exhilaration and terror. "Rebecca, I don't know what to say," he stammered, his heart pounding in his chest. "I've been feeling the same way, but I've been so afraid to admit it. I don't want to hurt Monica or betray your trust." Rebecca moved closer to Dylan, her hand now gently caressing his cheek. "I know, my dear. I know how difficult this is, but I can't ignore these feelings any longer. I want you, Dylan. I want us to be together." Before Dylan could respond, Rebecca leaned in and pressed her lips against his in a passionate, desperate kiss. Dylan's mind went blank as he surrendered to the overwhelming desire that had been building within him. He pulled Rebecca closer, deepening the kiss as the world around them faded away. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathless and flushed, the reality of their actions began to sink in. Dylan felt a wave of guilt and shame wash over him, but he couldn't deny the intense connection he shared with Rebecca. "This is wrong," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We can't do this. I love Monica, and she's your daughter. I never meant for this to happen." Rebecca cupped Dylan's face in her hands, her eyes filled with a mix of longing and regret. "I know, my darling, I know, but I can't ignore these feelings, and I don't think you can either. We'll figure this out, I promise. Just please don't push me away." Dylan closed his eyes, torn between his love for his wife and the undeniable pull he felt towards Rebecca. He knew that what they were doing was wrong, that it could destroy everything they held dear. But in that moment, all he could think about was the warmth of Rebecca's touch and the taste of her lips. As the guilt and shame warred with the powerful desire coursing through him, Dylan found himself utterly and completely captivated by the woman who had become so much more than just his mother-in-law. The seeds of betrayal had been sown, and there was no turning back. Chapter 3. The tension between Dylan and Rebecca had been building for weeks, an unspoken current of desire that threatened to consume them both. As they sat together in the living room, sipping wine and engaging in yet another deep, intimate conversation, the air was thick with an electricity that neither of them could ignore. Rebecca's hand gently came to rest on Dylan's arm, her touch sending a jolt of electricity through his body. She leaned in closer, her eyes searching his face, and Dylan felt his heart racing in his chest. "Dylan, Rebecca hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. "I don't know how to say this, but I've developed feelings for you. Feelings that go beyond just a mother-in-law and son-in-law." Dylan's eyes widened, his mind racing with a whirlwind of emotions. He had been trying to push down his own growing attraction to Rebecca, but now, hearing her confession, he felt a mix of exhilaration and terror. "Rebecca, I don't know what to say," he stammered, his voice trembling. "I've been feeling the same way, but I've been so afraid to admit it. I don't want to hurt Monica or betray your trust." Rebecca moved closer to Dylan, her hand now gently caressing his cheek. "I know, my dear. I know how difficult this is, but I can't ignore these feelings any longer. I want you, Dylan. I want us to be together. Before Dylan could respond, Rebecca leaned in and pressed her lips against his in a passionate, desperate kiss. Dylan's mind went blank as he surrendered to the overwhelming desire that had been building within him. He pulled Rebecca closer, deepening the kiss as the world around them faded away. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathless and flushed, the reality of their actions began to sink in. Dylan felt a wave of guilt and shame wash over him, but he couldn't deny the intense connection he shared with Rebecca. "This is wrong," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We can't do this. I love Monica, and she's your daughter. I never meant for this to happen." Rebecca cupped Dylan's face in her hands, her eyes filled with a mix of longing and regret. "I know, my darling. I know. But I can't ignore these feelings, and I don't think you can either. We'll figure this out, I promise. Just please don't push me away." Dylan closed his eyes, torn between his love for his wife and the undeniable pull he felt towards Rebecca. He knew that what they were doing was wrong, that it could destroy everything they held dear. But in that moment, all he could think about was the warmth of Rebecca's touch and the taste of her lips. As the guilt and shame warred with the powerful desire coursing through him, Dylan found himself utterly and completely captivated by the woman who had become so much more than just his mother-in-law. The kiss had been a moment of pure, unrestrained passion, a surrender to the feelings that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. Dylan could still feel the lingering warmth of Rebecca's lips on his own, the softness of her skin against his fingertips. It was as if a dam had burst, releasing a flood of emotions that had been carefully contained. Yet, as the initial rush of euphoria began to fade, the weight of their actions settled heavily upon them. Dylan's heart was racing, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. He loved Monica more than anything, and the thought of betraying her trust, of shattering the foundation of their marriage, filled him with a deep, overwhelming sense of guilt. But the pull of Rebecca was undeniable. There was something about her beauty, her intelligence, her unwavering confidence, that had captivated Dylan from the moment they had first met. And now, with her confession of her own feelings, the temptation to give in to the forbidden desire was almost too strong to resist. Dylan opened his eyes, his gaze locking with Rebecca's. In her eyes, he saw a reflection of his own internal turmoil, a swirling mix of longing, regret, and uncertainty. They both knew that what they had done was wrong, that the consequences of their actions could be devastating. But the connection between them was undeniable, a bond that seemed to transcend the boundaries of what was socially acceptable. Slowly, Rebecca's hand slid down from Dylan's face, coming to rest on his chest. "Dylan, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know this is wrong, but I can't ignore how I feel. I want you, more than I've ever wanted anything. And I think you want me too." Dylan felt his breath catch in his throat, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that he should push her away, that he should end this before it spiraled out of control. But the truth was, he didn't want to. The desire that had been simmering within him had now erupted into a raging inferno, and the thought of extinguishing it was almost unbearable. Tentatively, he reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from Rebecca's face, his fingers lingering on the soft, warm skin of her cheek. "I do," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "God help me, I do want you, Rebecca. More than I've ever wanted anything." The admission hung in the air between them, a declaration of their shared, forbidden desire. Dylan knew that he was crossing a line, that he was betraying the trust of the woman he loved more than anything. But in that moment, with Rebecca's eyes locked on his, all rational thought seemed to slip away. Slowly, almost involuntarily, their lips met again, the kiss deeper and more passionate than the first. Dylan pulled Rebecca closer, his hands exploring the curves of her body as she melted into his embrace. The world around them faded away, replaced by a haze of overwhelming sensation and the pounding of their hearts. As they lost themselves in the embrace, the guilt and shame that had threatened to consume them only moments ago seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sense of reckless abandon. They knew that they were playing with fire, that the consequences of their actions could be devastating. But in that moment, nothing else mattered except the burning desire that had finally been unleashed. The seeds of betrayal had been sown, and there was no turning back. Chapter 4. In the weeks that followed their fateful encounter, Dylan and Rebecca found themselves in a constant state of unease, their every interaction laced with the weight of their forbidden desire. They had crossed a line, surrendering to a passion that threatened to consume them both, and now they were faced with the daunting task of maintaining their affair in complete secrecy. The tension between them was palpable, a constant undercurrent that simmered just beneath the surface. Whenever they were in the same room as Monica, Dylan felt as though his guilt and shame were written all over his face, a betrayal that he was certain his wife would see through in an instant. Rebecca, too, struggled with the burden of their actions. She had always been a confident and self-assured woman, but now she found herself constantly on edge, her mind racing with thoughts of the consequences that could befall them if their secret were to be discovered. The thought of losing her daughter and the family she had come to cherish filled her with a deep, overwhelming dread. Yet, despite the ever-present threat of exposure, Dylan and Rebecca found themselves drawn to each other like moths to a flame. Whenever they were alone, the air crackled with an electric tension, and it took every ounce of their willpower to resist the urge to give in to their desires once more. They would steal fleeting glances across the room, their eyes locking for just a moment before hastily looking away, fearful of arousing suspicion. Casual touches and lingering gazes became a delicate dance, a silent language that only they understood, as they navigated the treacherous waters of their forbidden affair. In the quiet moments, when the house was still and the world seemed to hold its breath, Dylan and Rebecca would allow themselves to indulge in the forbidden fantasies that had taken root in their minds. They would imagine what it would be like to be together, to openly express the depth of their feelings without the constant threat of discovery hanging over them. But the harsh reality would always come crashing back, a cold dose of reason that served to remind them of the devastating consequences that could unfold if they were to be caught. The guilt that weighed heavily on Dylan's conscience was a constant companion, a nagging voice that told him he was betraying the woman he loved more than anything. As the days turned into weeks, the strain of maintaining this charade began to take its toll. Dylan found himself becoming more distant and distracted, his mind constantly preoccupied with the tangled web of emotions he was grappling with. Monica, ever the perceptive and loving wife, noticed the subtle changes in her husband's behavior, and her concern only continued to grow. "Dylan, is everything all right?" she would ask, her brow furrowed with worry. "You've seemed a little off lately. Is there something you want to talk about?" Dylan would offer her a reassuring smile, his heart aching with the knowledge that he was keeping a devastating secret from the woman he cherished. "I'm fine, honey. Just a little stressed with school, that's all. You know how it is." Monica would nod, seemingly satisfied with his response, but Dylan could see the lingering doubt in her eyes. He hated himself for lying to her, for betraying the trust that was the foundation of their marriage. But the thought of losing her, of shattering the life they had built together, was simply too much to bear. Meanwhile, Rebecca found herself grappling with her own internal turmoil. She had always been a devoted mother, putting her daughter's needs before her own without hesitation. But now, as she found herself irrevocably drawn to Dylan, she was forced to confront the reality that she was willing to risk everything for this forbidden connection. The guilt that weighed on her was a heavy burden, a constant reminder of the betrayal she was committing against her own flesh and blood. And she loved Monica dearly, and the thought of hurting her, of potentially destroying the family they had built together, filled Rebecca with a deep, aching sorrow. Yet, despite these overwhelming emotions, the pull of Dylan was undeniable. Whenever they were in each other's presence, it was as if the world around them faded away, leaving only the two of them and the electric tension that crackled between them. The more they tried to resist, the stronger the temptation became, until it felt like an all-consuming force that threatened to swallow them whole. As the family gathered for a special occasion, the strain of their secret affair became increasingly palpable. Dylan found himself constantly on edge, his eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign that his guilt and shame were written across his face. Rebecca, too, felt the weight of their deception, her laughter and smiles tinged with an underlying tension that only she and Dylan could sense. The evening wore on, the air thick with an unspoken discomfort that only seemed to grow more pronounced with each passing moment. Monica, ever the attentive hostess, tried her best to keep the conversation flowing and the mood light, but even she could not ignore the subtle shifts in the dynamics between her husband and her mother. As the night drew to a close and the guests began to depart, Monica turned to Dylan, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and confusion. "Dylan, is everything all right? You've seemed a little distant tonight. Is there something you want to talk about?" Dylan felt his heart leap into his throat, his mind racing with a desperate attempt to come up with a plausible excuse. No, everything's fine," he stammered, his voice betraying his nervousness. "I'm just a little tired, that's all. It's been a long day." Monica studied him for a moment, her gaze searching his face, and Dylan felt a pang of guilt as he saw the worry etched in her features. "All right, if you're sure," she said, her voice laced with uncertainty. "But you know you can talk to me about anything, right?" Dylan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Of course, honey. I know that. I'm fine, really. Don't worry about me." As Monica turned to leave, Dylan's eyes instinctively sought out Rebecca's, and the two of them shared a fleeting, charged glance that spoke volumes of the turmoil they were both experiencing. In that moment, they were both acutely aware of the fragile web they had woven, and the ever-present threat of it unraveling before their very eyes. The seeds of betrayal had been sown, and the consequences were looming ever closer. Chapter 5. The tension in the household had become palpable, a thick, suffocating cloud that seemed to permeate every corner of the small home. Monica had noticed the subtle shifts in Dylan's behavior, the way his gaze would linger a little too long on her mother, the way he would suddenly become distant and distracted during their conversations. At first, she had brushed it off, attributing it to the stresses of university and the adjustments of married life. But as the weeks wore on, the nagging suspicion in the back of her mind refused to be ignored. There was something going on, something that Dylan was keeping from her, and the thought of it made her heart ache with a mixture of fear and dread. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Monica decided to confront her husband. "Dylan, can we talk?" she asked, her voice soft and tentative. "I can't help but feel like something's been bothering you lately. You've just seemed so off. Is everything all right?" Dylan felt his pulse quicken, his palms growing clammy as he struggled to maintain his composure. "Everything's fine, honey," he replied, offering her a reassuring smile that felt more like a grimace. "I've just been a little stressed with school, that's all. You know how it can be." Monica studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she searched his face for any sign of deception. "I know you, Dylan, and I know when something's wrong. Please talk to me. I'm here for you no matter what." The genuine concern in her voice only served to deepen Dylan's guilt, the weight of his betrayal pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. He wanted to tell her the truth, to confess everything and beg for her forgiveness. But the fear of losing her, of shattering the life they had built together, was simply too much to bear. "I promise, it's nothing," he insisted, reaching out to take her hand in his own. "I'm just a little stressed, that's all. But I'm fine, really. There's no need to worry." Monica could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted away from hers for the briefest of moments. She knew deep down that he was hiding something from her. But she also knew her husband, and she could see the desperation in his expression, the silent plea for her to let it go. Reluctantly, she nodded, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. "Okay, Dylan, I trust you. But please, if something's bothering you, don't shut me out. I'm here for you, always." As Monica rose from the couch and left the room, Dylan felt a wave of relief wash over him, quickly followed by a crushing sense of guilt. He had lied to the woman he loved more than anything, betraying her trust in the most fundamental way. And the thought of her discovering the truth, of losing her forever, was a fate worse than death. Across the hall, Rebecca had witnessed the exchange, her heart pounding in her chest. She had seen the way Dylan's eyes had darted away, the way his body had tensed at Monica's probing questions. And she knew in that moment that their secret was in jeopardy. Quietly, she made her way to Dylan's room, her mind racing with 1,000 different scenarios. When she finally reached the door, she knocked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dylan, it's me. We need to talk." Dylan felt his stomach twist into knots as he heard Rebecca's voice, the familiar warmth of her tone only serving to deepen his sense of guilt and shame. Reluctantly, he opened the door, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of fear and longing. "Rebecca, I don't know what to do," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Monica's starting to suspect something and I can't keep lying to her. I can't keep betraying her trust like this." Rebecca reached out, her hand gently caressing Dylan's cheek. "Shh, my darling, it's going to be all right," she soothed, her voice low and comforting. "We'll figure this out, I promise. But you can't let Monica find out the truth, not yet. It would destroy her, and it would destroy our family." Dylan felt the weight of her words, the gravity of the situation they had found themselves in. He knew that Rebecca was right, that the truth would shatter everything they held dear. But the thought of continuing to deceive Monica, the woman he loved with every fiber of his being, was almost too much to bear. "I can't keep doing this, Rebecca," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep lying to her. It's tearing me apart, and I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Rebecca pulled him into a tight embrace, her fingers threading through his hair as she held him close. "Shh, my darling, I know how difficult this is, but we have to be strong for all of our sakes. We can't let Monica find out, not yet. We'll figure this out, I promise. Just trust me, Dylan. Trust me." Dylan felt himself melting into her embrace, the familiar warmth and comfort of her touch soothing the turmoil that raged within him. He knew deep down that what they were doing was wrong, that the consequences of their actions could be devastating. But in that moment, all he could focus on was the overwhelming need to be in her arms, to lose himself in the forbidden desire that consumed them both. As they held each other, the weight of their betrayal hung heavy in the air, a dark cloud that threatened to swallow them whole. Both of them knew that the fragile web they had woven was in danger of unraveling, and the thought of facing the fallout was enough to make their hearts race with fear and uncertainty. But for now, in the quiet sanctuary of Dylan's room, they allowed themselves to be consumed by the passion that had brought them to this point, their lips meeting in a desperate, searing kiss that sought to silence the voices of reason and conscience that still lingered in the back of their minds. The seeds of betrayal had been sown, and the harvest was rapidly approaching. Monica, unaware of the turmoil that raged within her own home, continued about her day, her mind preoccupied with the lingering concerns she held for her husband. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that Dylan was keeping a secret from her. And as much as she tried to push those thoughts aside, they continued to nag at her, a persistent whisper that refused to be silenced. As the evening wore on, Monica found herself unable to focus on her studies, her gaze constantly drifting towards the closed door of Dylan's room. She knew that he was in there, perhaps with her mother, and the thought of it made her stomach twist with a mixture of unease and dread. Slowly she rose from her desk, her footsteps soft and tentative as she made her way down the hallway. She paused outside the door, her hand hesitating on the handle as a wave of uncertainty washed over her. Part of her wanted to turn back, to ignore the nagging suspicion that had taken root in her mind. But another, more persistent part urged her to press on, to confront the truth no matter how painful it might be. Steeling her nerves, Monica turned the handle and pushed the door open, her heart pounding in her chest as she stepped into the room. At first she saw nothing out of the ordinary, just Dylan sitting alone on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. But then, a sudden movement in the corner of her eye caught her attention, and her gaze was drawn to the adjoining bathroom, where the door stood slightly ajar. And there, in the dimly lit room, she caught a glimpse of a familiar figure, her mother Rebecca, hastily straightening her clothes. The world seemed to slow to a crawl as the pieces fell into place, the realization of what was happening striking Monica like a physical blow. Her eyes widened in shock, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the scene before her, her heart shattering into a million pieces. "Dylan, Mom!" she whispered, her voice barely audible as the weight of their betrayal threatened to crush her. In that moment, time seemed to stand still, the air thick with a palpable tension that threatened to suffocate them all. Dylan and Rebecca, caught in the act, froze, their eyes filled with a mix of guilt, fear, and desperate pleading. And Monica, the innocent victim in this twisted web of deceit, felt her world crumbling around her, the foundations of her life shaken to the core. The seeds of betrayal had been sown, and now the harvest had begun. Chapter 6. The truth had finally come to light, shattering the delicate facade that Dylan and Rebecca had so carefully constructed. As Monica stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief, the weight of their betrayal hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that threatened to suffocate them all. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the three of them frozen in a tableau of guilt, fear, and anguish. Dylan felt his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing with a desperate attempt to find the right words, the perfect explanation that could somehow undo the damage that had been done. But the words refused to come, his tongue heavy and uncooperative as he stared back at his wife, his eyes pleading for forgiveness, for understanding, for anything that could ease the agonizing pain he knew he had inflicted upon her. And then, as if a dam had burst, the floodgates of emotion opened, and Monica's world came crashing down around her. The tears streamed down her face, her body shaking with the force of her sobs as the realization of her husband's betrayal sank in. "How could you?" she cried, her voice raw and broken. "How could you do this to me? To us?" Dylan felt his heart shatter at the sound of her anguish, the guilt and shame threatening to consume him whole. He opened his mouth, desperate to offer some kind of explanation, some feeble attempt at justification, but the words caught in his throat, choked by the weight of his own remorse. Rebecca, too, found herself at a loss for words, her eyes downcast, unable to meet the accusing gaze of her daughter. She had never imagined that her forbidden desire would lead to such devastation, such a complete and utter destruction of the family she had cherished. "Monica, she began, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen." "Don't!" Monica cut her off, her hand raised in a gesture of defiance. "Don't you dare try to apologize. You betrayed me, both of you. How could you do this? How could you betray me like this?" The anguish in her voice was palpable, a raw and visceral pain that tore at the hearts of those who had once been the most important people in her life. Dylan felt the weight of her words, the crushing realization that he had shattered the very foundation of their marriage, the trust that had been the cornerstone of their relationship. "Monica, please, let me explain," he pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant to hurt you. I love you more than anything. This was a mistake, a terrible, terrible mistake." But Monica shook her head, her eyes burning with a mixture of fury and unbearable heartbreak. "A mistake?" she scoffed, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "This wasn't a mistake, Dylan. This was a deliberate, conscious choice. You betrayed me with my own mother of all people." The words hung in the air, a devastating indictment that left Dylan and Rebecca reeling, their guilt and shame now laid bare for all to see. They had thought they could keep their forbidden affair hidden, that they could somehow maintain the delicate balance of their lives without ever facing the consequences. But the truth had a way of revealing itself, no matter how hard one might try to bury it. And now, as Monica stood before them, her heart shattered and her trust irreparably broken, they were forced to confront the full weight of their actions. "I want you both out," Monica said, her voice eerily calm, a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil that raged within her. "I want you out of this house, out of my life. I can't even look at either of you right now." Dylan felt his heart sink, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. He had lost everything, the life he had built with the woman he loved more than anything, and the knowledge that he had brought this upon himself, that his own selfish desires had led to such devastation, only served to deepen the anguish that consumed him. "Monica, please let me," he began, but she cut him off with a raised hand, her eyes filled with a resolve that left no room for argument. "No, Dylan, I'm done. I'm done with all of this. I want you both gone now. I can't even bear to look at you anymore." With that, Monica turned on her heel and fled the room, her sobs echoing through the hallway as she disappeared from sight. Dylan and Rebecca were left in the wake of her departure, the weight of their betrayal hanging heavy in the air, a burden that they would now have to bear alone. In the deafening silence that followed, Dylan felt the full force of his guilt and shame wash over him, a tidal wave of emotion that threatened to drown him. He had lost everything, his wife, his family, the very foundation of his life. And the knowledge that he had been the one to destroy it all was a burden he knew he would have to carry for the rest of his days. Beside him, Rebecca sat in stunned silence, her own tears streaming down her face as the reality of their situation sank in. She had never imagined that her forbidden desire would lead to such devastation, such a complete and utter destruction of the family she had cherished. And now, as she watched her daughter's world crumble before her very eyes, she felt the weight of her own culpability like a physical weight upon her shoulders. The seeds of betrayal had been sown, and now the harvest had been reaped. The consequences of their actions had come to bear, and there was no turning back. As Dylan and Rebecca sat in the aftermath of their betrayal, they knew that the road ahead would be a long and arduous one, filled with the agonizing task of rebuilding their lives from the ashes of what they had once held so dear. Chapter 7. The aftermath of the devastating revelation hung heavy in the air, a suffocating cloud of guilt, shame, and heartbreak that permeated every corner of the small home. Monica, her eyes red-rimmed from endless tears, sat alone in the living room, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all, to lash out at the two people she had once trusted more than anyone. But another deeper part of her felt a crushing sense of resignation, a realization that no amount of anger or recrimination could undo the damage that had been done. She had loved Dylan with every fiber of her being, their bond forged through years of shared dreams, laughter, and unwavering support. And to know that he had betrayed that love, that he had willingly surrendered to the temptation of her own mother, was a betrayal so profound that it threatened to shatter the very foundations of her existence. As the hours ticked by, Monica found herself grappling with a myriad of questions, each one more agonizing than the last. How long had this been going on? Had they been laughing at her all this time, reveling in their secret tryst while she remained blissfully unaware? And how could her own mother, the woman who had raised her, the person she trusted more than anyone, do this to her? The weight of these questions was a heavy burden, one that threatened to consume her completely. She had thought she knew her husband, her mother, the very people who were supposed to love and support her unconditionally. But now, in the aftermath of their betrayal, she felt utterly lost, adrift in a sea of shattered illusions and broken promises. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, Monica heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Steeling herself, she turned to face the two people who had once been the most important in her life, her heart pounding in her chest. Dylan, his eyes downcast, his shoulders slumped in defeat, slowly made his way into the room, Rebecca trailing behind him. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the occasional sniffle or the sound of a stifled sob. "Monica," Dylan began, his voice trembling, I don't even know what to say. I'm so sorry, more sorry than you can ever know. I never meant to hurt you, to betray you like this. It just happened, and I don't," Monica interrupted, her voice sharp and cold. "Don't you dare try to make excuses. You made a choice, Dylan. You chose to betray me, to betray our marriage, with my own mother of all people." Dylan flinched at her words, the truth of them cutting him to the core. He had no defense, no justification that could possibly make up for the pain he had inflicted upon the woman he loved. All he could do was stand there, his heart heavy with regret and shame. Rebecca, her own eyes filled with tears, stepped forward, her hands trembling. "Monica, please, let me explain. I never meant for this to happen. I fell in love with Dylan, and I couldn't control my feelings. I know that's no excuse, but enough," Monica cried, her voice laced with anguish. "I don't want to hear another word from either of you. You've both betrayed me, betrayed the trust that was the foundation of our family. I can't even look at you right now." The three of them stood in silence, the weight of Monica's words hanging heavy in the air. Dylan felt his heart shattering, the realization that he had destroyed everything he held dear crashing down upon him with devastating force. "Monica, please," he pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I've hurt you, and I know there's no way I can ever make it up to you, but I love you more than anything. I want to try and make this right, to try and rebuild what we had. Please give me a chance." Monica shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. A chance? After what you've done? How can I ever trust you again, Dylan? How can I ever look at either of you without seeing the betrayal that's torn our family apart? Rebecca stepped forward, her own voice trembling. Monica, I know you have every right to be angry with us, to hate us. But please don't punish Dylan for my mistakes. This is on me, not him. If you're going to be angry at anyone, be angry at me. Monica let out a bitter laugh, the sound devoid of any trace of humor. Oh, don't worry, I'm angry at both of you. But you're right, Rebecca. This is your fault just as much as it is Dylan's. You're my mother, for God's sake. How could you do this to me? The anguish in her voice was palpable, a raw and visceral pain that tore at the hearts of those who had once been the most important people in her life. Dylan felt the weight of her words, the crushing realization that he had shattered the very foundation of their marriage, the trust that had been the cornerstone of their relationship. Monica, please let me try to make this right, he pleaded, his voice thick with emotion. I know I've destroyed everything, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I love you more than anything in this world. I want to try and rebuild what we had, to find a way to move past this. Monica's eyes narrowed, her gaze hard and unyielding. Move past this? How, Dylan? How can I ever look at you the same way again? How can I ever trust you after what you've done? She turned her attention to Rebecca, her expression filled with a mixture of betrayal and disgust. And you, Mom. You're supposed to be the one person I can always count on, the one person who would never hurt me. How could you do this? Rebecca opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat, choked by the weight of her own guilt and shame. She had no defense, no excuse that could possibly justify the pain she had inflicted upon her own daughter. The three of them stood there, frozen in a tableau of anguish and despair, the air thick with the weight of their betrayal. Monica felt as if she were suffocating, the walls of her once comfortable home closing in around her, a constant reminder of the shattered trust and broken promises that had once defined her life. I want you both out, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't even look at you anymore. I want you out of this house, out of my life. I need time to try and figure out how to move on from this, if that's even possible. Dylan felt his heart sink, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. He had lost everything, the life he had built with the woman he loved more than anything, and the knowledge that he had brought this upon himself, that his own selfish desires had led to such devastation, only served to deepen the anguish that consumed him. Monica, please let me, he began, but she cut him off with a raised hand, her eyes filled with a resolve that left no room for argument. No, Dylan, I'm done. I'm done with all of this. I want you both gone now. I can't even bear to look at you anymore. With that, Monica turned on her heel and fled the room, her sobs echoing through the hallway as she disappeared from sight. Dylan and Rebecca were left in the wake of her departure, the weight of their betrayal hanging heavy in the air, a burden that they would now have to bear alone. In the deafening silence that followed, Dylan felt the full force of his guilt and shame wash over him, a tidal wave of emotion that threatened to drown him. He had lost everything, his wife, his family, the very foundation of his life. And the knowledge that he had been the one to destroy it all was a burden he knew he would have to carry for the rest of his days. Beside him, Rebecca sat in stunned silence, her own tears streaming down her face as the reality of their situation sank in. She had never imagined that her forbidden desire would lead to such devastation, such a complete and utter destruction of the family she had cherished. And now, as she watched her daughter's world crumble before her very eyes, she felt the weight of her own culpability like a physical weight upon her shoulders. The two of them stood there, their lives in ruins, the future uncertain and fraught with the daunting task of rebuilding from the ashes of what they had once held so dear. They knew that the road ahead would be long and arduous, filled with the agonizing process of confronting the consequences of their actions and the pain they had inflicted upon the one person they had both sworn to love and protect. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a warm golden glow, Dylan and Rebecca knew that their lives would never be the same. The seeds of betrayal had been sown, and now the harvest had been reaped. The only question that remained was whether they would have the strength and the courage to somehow find a way to move forward, to try and pick up the pieces of their shattered lives and find a path to redemption. It was a daunting prospect, one that filled them both with a sense of overwhelming dread and uncertainty. But as they stood there, their eyes meeting in a silent acknowledgement of the pain they had caused, a glimmer of hope began to emerge. A small, fragile ember that perhaps, just perhaps, could be nurtured and coaxed into a flame that could guide them through the darkness that now enveloped their lives. The road ahead would be long and arduous, filled with the agonizing task of rebuilding their lives from the ashes of what they had once held so dear. But as they took their first tentative steps forward, Dylan and Rebecca knew that they had no choice but to try, for the sake of their own redemption, and for the faint, flickering hope that one day they might find a way to heal the wounds they had inflicted upon the woman they both loved more than anything.